Captain Midnight.
We're just a few short months away from the release of Avengers: Infinity War. Arguably Marvel's biggest gamble to date, with everyone from Iron Man to Black Panther to Rocket Raccoon making an appearance, leading us into Phase 4 and bringing an end to the MCU as we know it. Directed by the Russo Brothers, the same guys responsible for one of the best episodes of Community, oh and also that little Civil War movie you may have heard of, Infinity War has a lot of characters and storylines to balance. So here's a few of my suggestions for how the movie can live up to the extremely high expectations. Number 5. Get Thanos right. I'm not going to go too deep on this one because it was the subject of a previous video of mine, which you can find a link to in the description if you want to check that out. But it should go without saying that after this many years of build-up, he has to be a great villain. And the Russo brothers seem to know this as well, telling CNET in an interview, the biggest new element in the movie is Thanos and the fact that he's entering the storytelling in a very bold, strong way, to the degree that he's almost one of the leads. We've shaped an interesting narrative around him that in some ways leans heavily on a heist film in the fact that he's going after the Infinity Stones in a much bolder, successful way than he has in the past. That sounds really promising to me, and gives me hope that there is a way that the Mad Titan can live up to his reputation. Number 4. Respect the solo films. Avengers: Age of Ultron was quite a while ago now. New characters have been introduced and old characters have changed quite a bit. But sometimes when a different creative team takes over, it can feel like certain characters are taking a step backwards. You see this in comics all the time, where, say, Wolverine's character development by one writer will be completely ignored when he's included in a big team-up book. It would be great if Infinity War could avoid this and pay close attention to the development of characters like Star-Lord, Rocket, Thor, and Spider-Man, and what they've gone through since they were first introduced. That's part of what makes Avengers movies so tricky, because in a way it's not just a sequel to Age of Ultron. It's a sequel to Civil War, Doctor Strange, Homecoming, Guardians Volume 2, and the list goes on. Obviously some characters are going to get a little less time in the spotlight than others, but I do think it's important that every character at least gets something of an arc that farthers their journey. And I want the Thor of Ragnarok to show up, not the one from the last Avengers. Because without keeping those character arcs in mind, the movie could easily devolve into giant battles with no real purpose. Number 3. Use the Guardians wisely. So keeping with this theme of using the characters correctly, I think this is especially important when you're talking about the Guardians of the Galaxy. Now obviously the team has never been in an Avengers movie before, which makes sense. Their own movies already have enough to juggle and giving everyone on the team enough to do, that adding another team to that dynamic is pretty tough. But 2 Guardians movies in, I think they are well established enough that that's less of an issue. Still, these characters could have a really hard time fitting in with the more grounded tone of something like Civil War, which makes me a little worried for how Infinity War plans to utilize them. It's still hard for me to picture Groot hanging out with Nick Fury or the Winter Soldier, being from such drastically different sides of the Marvel Universe. But it looks like this movie is going to give that a shot. So I just hope that the script is balanced and well thought out enough that there won't be any major clashes in tone. Number 2. Don't advertise other projects. I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but one of my least favorite things that MCU movies do sometimes is try to set up future solo movies in a way that has no real impact and at times is actively detrimental to the story of the actual film you're watching. Iron Man 2 I think is the biggest offender, acting as kind of an advertisement for future films, but that was very early on in the MCU, so I can kind of forgive it. It crops up in other movies too though, and apparently being forced to insert things like Thor's psychedelic cave pool party scene in Ultron is one of the main reasons Joss Whedon was unhappy with Marvel after finishing that film. And with good reason. Every MCU film needs to be able to stand on its own merits and not have to do a bunch of exposition for a completely different film. And this should especially be true of the Avengers films. These things are the main event after all, the culmination of years of solo films. Taking our attention away from the story it's telling would be a huge mistake. Hopefully Marvel has learned its lesson from Age of Ultron and are just letting the Russo brothers do what they feel is right. There won't just be a random scene that's basically an ad for Ant-Man and the Wasp or something. Number 1. Make death matter. Okay, some people might disagree with me on this. like a lot. But I'm just gonna throw it out there. In Avengers Infinity War, one or more of the major Avengers need to die, permanently. There's long been a criticism of superhero comics that death doesn't actually mean anything. How many times has Superman come back from the grave? Or Professor X been revealed to have faked his own death? Personally, if the individual story is great, I don't really care that much if Marvel and DC go back and invalidate it later, but I do agree that it is kind of an annoying trend. And that's kind of played out in the MCU too. The big death in the first film, Agent Coulson, went on to star in his own series after that. But that could change here. Contracts are expiring, and actors like Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans have made it clear that they're not going to be playing these characters forever. So why not give them the spectacular send-off their characters deserve? After all, the villain has been built up over the years as the ultimate threat to the team, so I would feel a little ripped off if he doesn't actually live up to that threat. The MCU movies of 2017, by and large, were very funny, lighter films, and there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But I also think that acknowledging the darker side of the Marvel Universe would be interesting, and having a death that's impactful and permanent could really set Infinity War apart. None of this Quicksilver stuff where it's a version of the character we barely know and we don't really care about dying, but someone like Iron Man or Captain America, a real cornerstone of the MCU. And honestly, I think the odds are pretty good that something like that will happen. Marvel has been very hush-hush about Phase 4, and Kevin Feige has been talking about how different the MCU will be after Infinity War for a long time. So it feels like time. Time to take big risks and make some bold moves. It's not that I don't want any more Iron Man or Captain America movies. I love those characters. But with both actors looking for the door, I'd much rather see an end to their stories than see them be recast. Because really, how do you recast Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark? I'll go ahead and answer that for you. You don't. And after so many cosmic battles and skyscraper leveling fights, I think it's kind of important that death actually means something in this universe. That it isn't just C-list characters, villains, and nameless extras who can bite the dust, but are iconic leads too. That would be a huge move for Marvel and Disney to make, and one that they might hesitate about when Iron Man and Captain America sell millions of dollars of merchandise every year. Because if Infinity War is really a war, there has to be some casualties. And you know, maybe it is Tony Stark and Steve Rogers' time to go.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes.